Sarah Martinez found her dog hanging from the backyard fence at exactly 6:47 am on a Tuesday morning. The rope was tied in a perfect sailor's knot, something she'd never seen before in her quiet suburban neighborhood. As she screamed and cut down her beloved golden retriever, Max, she noticed her neighbor David watching from his kitchen window with what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. The police called it a random act of cruelty, probably teenagers pulling a sick prank. But Sarah knew better. She'd lived in Maple Grove for 3 years, and nothing like this had ever happened before David moved in next door 6 months ago. There was something about his smile that never quite reached his eyes, something about the way he always seemed to be watching her every move. Sarah worked as a trauma therapist at the local hospital, specializing in cases involving psychological manipulation and abuse. She recognized the signs better than most people, but recognizing them in a clinical setting was different from experiencing them firsthand. The way David had inserted himself into her daily routine felt calculated, deliberate. He always happened to be getting his mail when she came home from work. He always had a reason to strike up conversations about her schedule, her habits, her life. After burying Max in the backyard, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, reviewing everything that had happened since David's arrival. The small things she dismissed as coincidences now formed a disturbing pattern. Her newspaper going missing twice a week, always on days when she had important appointments. Her garbage cans being moved just enough to block her car in the driveway. The feeling of being watched even when she couldn't see anyone around. The psychological profile was textbook. David was establishing dominance through subtle intimidation, testing her boundaries, seeing how much he could get away with before she fought back. The dog wasn't random violence. It was a message. He was escalating, and Sarah knew from her professional experience that escalation in cases like this rarely stopped on its own. That evening, Sarah decided to document everything. She started a journal, writing down every interaction, every strange coincidence, every moment when she'd felt uncomfortable around David. The entries painted a picture that made her stomach turn. He'd been studying her for months, learning her vulnerabilities, her emotional triggers, her deepest fears. The worst part was how normal he appeared to everyone else. David had charmed the entire neighborhood within weeks of moving in. He volunteered at the community center, helped elderly Mrs. Peterson with her groceries, and always had a friendly wave for everyone. To the outside world, he was the perfect neighbor. Only Sarah seemed to see through the carefully constructed facade. As she wrote in her journal that night, Sarah heard footsteps on her front porch. She crept to the window and saw David standing there, not moving, just staring at her front door. He stayed for exactly 5 minutes, then walked back to his house without knocking or leaving anything behind. It was another message, another way of saying he could reach her whenever he wanted. Sarah's hands shook as she realized the true scope of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just a problematic neighbor or someone with poor social skills. David was a predator, and she was his chosen target. Everything he'd done so far was designed to isolate her, to make her feel paranoid and unstable, to prepare her for whatever he had planned next. The psychological manipulation was already working. Sarah found herself second-guessing her own perceptions, wondering if she was reading too much into innocent interactions. That doubt, she knew, was exactly what David wanted. He was playing mind games designed to erode her confidence in her own judgment, making her more vulnerable to future attacks. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Sarah lay in bed listening to every sound, hyper-aware of every shadow moving past her windows. She'd helped dozens of clients escape from psychological manipulation, but being on the receiving end felt completely different. The fear was real, immediate, and consuming. David had turned her own home into a prison of anxiety and hypervigilance. By morning, Sarah had made a decision. She wouldn't be David's victim. Her professional training had taught her how predators like him operated, and she was going to use that knowledge against him. But she also knew that fighting back would be dangerous. Men like David didn't handle rejection or resistance well, and his escalation pattern suggested he was capable of much worse than killing a pet. The game was just beginning, and Sarah realized with growing dread that David had been playing it much longer than she had. 3 weeks after Max's death, Elena Rodriguez received an envelope slipped under her apartment door while she was at work. Her name was written in elegant handwriting she didn't recognize, and inside was an invitation to a dinner party at an address she'd never heard of. The strange part wasn't the invitation itself, but the fact that it mentioned details about her life that only close friends would know. Elena had moved to the city 6 months ago to escape an abusive relationship back home in Texas. She deliberately kept a low profile, made few friends, and avoided social situations that might draw unwanted attention. The invitation knew she was a vegetarian, that she worked late shifts at the diner, and that she collected vintage postcards. Someone had been watching her, learning about her, and that realization made her hands tremble as she held the cream-colored paper. The return address led to an upscale apartment building downtown, the kind of place Elena could never afford on her waitress salary. The invitation was signed by someone named Marcus, who claimed to be hosting a small gathering for interesting people who prefer privacy. The phrase sent chills down Elena's spine because that was exactly how she described herself in the online support group for abuse survivors. Elena's first instinct was to throw the invitation away and forget about it. But something nagged at her throughout her shift at the diner. How had Marcus gotten access to information from a private, encrypted support group? How did he know her address when she'd been careful to keep it off all public records? The questions multiplied in her mind until she couldn't focus on taking orders or serving customers. That night, Elena did something she hadn't done in months. She called her best friend Rachel back in Texas, breaking her self-imposed isolation. Rachel listened as Elena described the invitation, the personal details, the feeling of being watched. Rachel's voice grew serious as she advised Elena to stay away from the dinner party and consider moving again if necessary. But Elena found herself drawn to the mystery despite her friend's warnings. The psychological pattern was familiar to Elena from her own experience with abuse. Her ex-boyfriend had used similar tactics, gathering information about her preferences and fears, then using that knowledge to create a false sense of intimacy and connection. The invitation felt like the same kind of manipulation designed to make her curious enough to put herself in danger. For 3 days, Elena debated what to do. Part of her wanted to ignore the invitation and continue hiding from the world. But another part, the part that had found the courage to leave Texas, wanted answers. She'd spent too many months being afraid, looking over her shoulder, jumping at shadows. Maybe it was time to face whatever this was head on. On the evening of the dinner party, Elena made a compromise with her fear. She would go to the address, but only to observe from outside. She wanted to see who entered the building, what kind of people accepted mysterious invitations from strangers. The decision felt both brave and foolish, but Elena had learned that sometimes those two things were the same. The apartment building was even more impressive in person, with a doorman and elegant lobby visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. Elena positioned herself across the street, watching as well-dressed people entered the building around 7 o'clock. They all looked normal, successful, unremarkable. Nothing about the scene suggested danger or deception. But as Elena prepared to leave, satisfied that she'd been overthinking the situation, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A woman about her own age was being escorted into the building by 2 men. The woman's body language screamed distress, her movements stiff and unwilling, but the men were skilled at making the interaction look normal to casual observers. Elena's training from the domestic violence shelter back home kicked in. She recognized the signs of coercion, the subtle ways abusers maintain control in public spaces. The woman wasn't attending the dinner party by choice, and Elena realized with growing horror that she might not have been the only one to receive an unexpected invitation. Without thinking clearly, Elena followed the group into the building. The doorman barely glanced at her as she slipped in behind another guest, her heart pounding as she realized she was walking directly into whatever trap had been set. But she couldn't abandon the other woman, not when she recognized the helpless terror in her eyes. The elevator rose to the 10th floor, and Elena found herself standing in an elegant hallway lined with expensive artwork. The sounds of conversation and classical music drifted from behind a partially open door marked 15B. Elena approached carefully, using skills she'd developed during months of avoiding her ex-boyfriend's surveillance. Through the crack in the door, Elena could see a beautifully appointed apartment filled with about a dozen people. They were seated around a large dining table, engaged in what appeared to be normal dinner party conversation. But Elena's trained eye caught the details others might miss. Several guests looked uncomfortable, their smiles forced, their posture tense. Wine glasses remained full, as if people were afraid to drink. At the head of the table sat a man Elena assumed was Marcus. He was younger than she'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of money and education. But there was something predatory about the way he watched his guests, like he was studying lab rats in an experiment. Elena was so focused on observing the dinner party that she didn't notice the footsteps behind her until it was too late. A hand closed over her mouth, and she felt the sharp prick of a needle in her neck. As consciousness faded, Elena heard Marcus's voice drifting from the dining room, explaining to his guests how the evening's real entertainment was about to begin. When consciousness returned to Maya Chen, she found herself sitting in what appeared to be an elegant living room with 5 other women, all roughly the same age and build. The similarities weren't coincidental, Maya realized with growing dread. They'd all been chosen for specific reasons, selected like pieces in some twisted game she didn't understand yet. Maya's background in forensic psychology kicked in as she assessed the situation. The room was windowless but well-appointed, designed to feel comfortable while being completely secure. Hidden cameras were visible in each corner, and the single door had no handle on the inside. This wasn't a random kidnapping for money or simple violence. Someone had invested significant time and resources into creating this scenario. The other women were in various stages of consciousness and panic. Elena, whom Maya had glimpsed at the dinner party, sat nearby looking alert but terrified. 2 others were still groggy from whatever drug had been used to subdue them. A 4th woman was crying silently, and the 5th appeared to be in shock, staring at nothing with empty eyes. A voice came through hidden speakers, cultured and calm. "Welcome to the experiment, ladies. You've been selected based on very specific psychological profiles, each representing different responses to trauma and manipulation. Over the next 72 hours, you'll participate in a series of challenges designed to test the limits of human psychological endurance." Maya felt her blood turn cold as the implications sank in. This wasn't just kidnapping. It was psychological experimentation using human subjects. The clinical tone of the announcement suggested whoever was running this had academic or professional training in psychology. They weren't dealing with a simple predator, but someone who understood exactly how to break down human minds systematically. "The rules are simple," the voice continued. "You must work together to solve puzzles and complete challenges. Failure results in consequences for the group. Success earns you privileges. Most importantly, everything you do is being recorded and analyzed. Your responses will contribute to groundbreaking research on female psychology under extreme stress." Maya's professional training helped her recognize the setup immediately. This was a variation of learned helplessness experiments designed to break down their sense of control and personal agency. The group dynamic would create additional pressure, as each person's actions would affect everyone else's well-being. It was psychological torture disguised as scientific research. The first challenge appeared on a screen mounted on the wall. It was a complex logic puzzle that would require cooperation to solve within the given time limit. Maya realized immediately that the puzzle itself wasn't the real test. The experiment was designed to observe how they handled pressure, made decisions under stress, and dealt with interpersonal conflict when survival was at stake. Elena proved to be sharper than her quiet demeanor suggested. She quickly grasped the mathematical components of the puzzle and began organizing the group's efforts. Maya contributed her analytical skills while trying to keep the other women calm. The 2 who had been crying were gradually pulled into the problem-solving process, their fear temporarily overridden by the need to focus. But the woman in shock, who introduced herself as Jennifer, remained unresponsive. Maya recognized the signs of dissociative episodes from her clinical work. Jennifer had mentally checked out as a protection mechanism, but her inability to participate created tension within the group. They needed everyone's input to solve the puzzle, but pushing too hard might cause Jennifer to retreat further into herself. As the timer counted down, Maya found herself taking charge of the group dynamics. She'd learned from years of therapy work that trauma responses varied dramatically between individuals. Elena was a fighter, channeling her fear into determined action. Two of the others were followers, looking for someone else to provide direction and hope. Jennifer was a flight risk, mentally escaping to avoid dealing with the reality of their situation. With minutes to spare, they solved the puzzle. The screen flashed green, and the voice returned with congratulations. "Excellent work. You've earned dinner and 8 hours of rest. Tomorrow's challenges will be more complex, but I'm confident you'll continue to exceed expectations." Maya felt sick at the pleased tone. They weren't people to this individual. They were test subjects providing data for some perverted research project. The psychological manipulation was already working on the group. Despite the horrible circumstances, they'd felt genuine satisfaction at solving the puzzle and earning rewards. They were being conditioned to seek their captor's approval. That night, as the others slept on cots that had emerged from hidden compartments in the walls, Maya lay awake analyzing their situation. The person running this experiment was highly intelligent, well-funded, and completely without conscience. They understood psychology well enough to design challenges that would reveal each woman's deepest vulnerabilities and breaking points. More disturbing was the realization that this was likely not the first time this had happened. The setup was too sophisticated, too perfectly designed for someone conducting their initial experiment. Maya suspected they were dealing with a serial psychological abuser who had refined their methods over multiple victims. The thought of other women who had been in this room before them made Maya's stomach churn. Elena whispered in the darkness, "How do we get out of here?" Maya whispered back, "We survive long enough to find his weakness. Everyone has one, even people like this. We just have to be smarter than he thinks we are." But privately, Maya wondered if intelligence would be enough against someone who had clearly been planning this for a very long time. The psychological games were just beginning, and Maya feared they were all going to discover things about themselves they never wanted to know. Dr. Victoria Sterling woke up in her own office, but something was terribly wrong. The familiar space felt alien and threatening, with subtle changes that made her question her own memory. Her patient files had been rearranged, personal items moved slightly, and worst of all, there were photographs on her desk of events she couldn't remember participating in. Victoria specialized in treating victims of psychological manipulation, and she recognized the tactics being used against her. This was gaslighting on a professional level, designed to make her doubt her own perceptions and memories. Someone with intimate knowledge of psychological warfare was systematically dismantling her sense of reality. The photographs showed her at various locations around the city, apparently having conversations with people she didn't recognize. In some images, she appeared to be in distress. In others, she looked angry or confused. All of them had been taken without her knowledge, documenting activities she had no memory of experiencing. Victoria's hand shook as she examined the images more closely. Her clothing was consistent with outfits she remembered wearing, and the backgrounds were places she visited regularly. But she had no recollection of the interactions captured in the photos. Either someone had drugged her repeatedly to create memory gaps, or her own mind was fracturing under stress she didn't consciously recognize. The worst photograph showed her standing in what appeared to be the windowless room where Maya and the other women had been held captive. Victoria was examining the setup with professional interest, as if she were consulting on the psychological experiment rather than being victimized by it. The image suggested a level of complicity that made her stomach turn. A folder on her desk contained detailed psychological profiles of 6 women, including herself. Each profile contained intimate details about their trauma histories, their vulnerabilities, and their likely responses to various forms of manipulation. Victoria recognized her own handwriting in the margins, notes and observations that she couldn't remember making. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't been selected as a victim for the psychological experiment. She'd been recruited as a consultant, helping to design the very tortures that had been inflicted on those women. The memory gaps weren't from being drugged. They were from dissociative episodes triggered by the moral horror of what she was being forced to participate in. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The integration process is almost complete. Tonight's session will help you remember everything. Your professional expertise has been invaluable to our research. The clinical language made her skin crawl because it sounded exactly like something she might write in her own case notes. Fragments of memory began returning as Victoria sat in her violated office. She remembered being approached by someone claiming to represent a legitimate research institute. They'd offered her an enormous consulting fee to help design psychological resilience tests for military applications. The project had seemed ethical, even important, at first. But as the sessions progressed, Victoria had realized the true nature of what she was helping to create. The experiments weren't about building resilience. They were about breaking people down systematically. When she'd tried to withdraw from the project, they'd used her own psychological expertise against her, creating the memory gaps and confusion that left her unable to trust her own perceptions. The person behind this wasn't just a predator. They were someone who understood exactly how to manipulate mental health professionals by exploiting their desire to help people. They'd turned Victoria's expertise into a weapon against innocent victims, then used psychological manipulation to make her complicit while keeping her consciously unaware of what she was doing. Victoria realized with growing horror that she needed to warn the other women if they were still alive. But she couldn't trust her own memories or perceptions. The psychological manipulation had been so thorough that she couldn't distinguish between what was real and what had been. implanted or suggested during her dissociative states. Her computer showed evidence of research she didn't remember conducting. Detailed analyses of each victim's psychological breaking points and recommended methods for exploiting their specific vulnerabilities. The work was thorough, professional, and absolutely horrifying. Victoria had helped create a blueprint for psychological torture, and she couldn't even remember doing it. The office door opened, and a man Victoria recognized but couldn't place walked in with a confident smile. "Dr. Sterling, I hope you're feeling more integrated today. We have one final session to complete your consultation, and then you'll be free to return to your normal practice with no memory of our collaboration." Victoria looked at him and felt a mix of recognition and revulsion that told her everything she needed to know. This was the person who had orchestrated everything, who had manipulated her into becoming an unwilling accomplice to psychological torture. And tonight, they were planning to erase her memory of the entire experience, leaving the other women with no advocate who understood what had been done to them. The psychological games weren't over. They were about to reach their horrifying conclusion, and Victoria realized she might be the only person who could stop them. But first, she had to figure out how to trust her own mind again. Isabella Vega had learned to recognize the signs of mind games from her childhood with a narcissistic father, but nothing had prepared her for this level of psychological manipulation. She was the newest addition to the group of women, brought in after Victoria's memory had been restored and the doctor had attempted to sabotage the experiment from within. The compound where they were being held was larger than Isabella had initially realized. Through careful observation during their supervised bathroom breaks, she'd mapped out at least 3 levels and multiple rooms designed for different types of psychological testing. This wasn't a temporary operation. It was a permanent research facility dedicated to studying human psychological breaking points. Isabella's advantage was that she'd grown up with a manipulator, learning to read micro-expressions and recognize emotional manipulation tactics from an early age. She could see things the others missed, the slight tells when their captor was lying, the moments when his confidence wavered, the patterns in his behavior that revealed his own psychological vulnerabilities. The man they now knew as Dr. Marcus Holloway had made a critical mistake by adding Isabella to the group. She was a software engineer with expertise in security systems, and during her first week in captivity, she'd identified multiple weaknesses in the facility's electronic infrastructure. The cameras had blind spots, the door locks operated on predictable timers, and most importantly, the ventilation system provided access routes that hadn't been properly secured. Victoria proved to be a valuable ally once her memories had been fully restored. Her psychological expertise, combined with her intimate knowledge of Holloway's methods, gave the group insights into how their captor's mind worked. Victoria explained that Holloway was conducting what he believed to be groundbreaking research on female psychological resilience, funded by sources she suspected were not entirely legitimate. The other women had been selected based on specific trauma profiles. Elena represented survivors of domestic abuse. Maya embodied academic high achievers with perfectionist tendencies. Jennifer showcased dissociative responses to overwhelming stress. And Victoria herself had been chosen as the expert whose knowledge could be weaponized against victims. Isabella's profile was different. She was the control group, the woman who had developed healthy coping mechanisms for psychological manipulation. Holloway's fatal flaw was his arrogance. He believed his own intelligence was superior to that of his test subjects, and he underestimated the collective power of women who had survived different types of trauma. Each woman brought unique strengths to their resistance efforts, and together they formed a formidable team despite the psychological pressure they were under. Isabella's escape plan required precise timing and absolute trust between the group members. Using her knowledge of the security systems, she had identified a 30-minute window each night when the facility operated on backup power for system updates. During this window, certain locks would default to open positions and some cameras would go offline for maintenance cycles. The psychological aspect of their escape was equally important. Holloway monitored their stress levels and emotional states through biometric sensors hidden throughout their living area. Isabella taught the others techniques for controlling their physiological responses, methods she'd learned to avoid triggering her father's rage during childhood. They had to appear broken and compliant while secretly planning their rebellion. On the chosen night, everything went according to plan until the final stage. The women successfully navigated the facility's corridors, disabled additional security measures, and reached the exit. But Holloway was waiting for them, having anticipated their escape attempt through psychological profiling that predicted their behavioral patterns with disturbing accuracy. "Did you really think I wouldn't know?" Holloway asked with the same calm, clinical tone they'd come to dread. "Your stress indicators have been elevated for days. Your biometric patterns showed deception markers during every interaction. I've been watching you plan this escape as part of the experiment." But Isabella had prepared for this contingency too. While Holloway had been monitoring their known biometric indicators, she'd been using meditation techniques to maintain false readings while concealing her real emotional state. More importantly, she'd been documenting everything through a hidden camera system she'd jury-rigged from facility equipment. "The police are already on their way," Isabella said quietly. "I've been streaming everything to external servers for the past 3 days. Your experiment, your methods, your identity, it's all been recorded and automatically uploaded to multiple law enforcement agencies if we failed to check in." For the first time since their captivity began, Holloway's calm facade cracked. The psychological tables had been turned, and the predator realized he had become the prey. His arrogance had blinded him to the possibility that his victims might be more resourceful and intelligent than his profile assessments had predicted. The women escaped that night, but their ordeal was far from over. The psychological scars from their experience would take years to heal, and the legal process of bringing Holloway to justice would require them to relive their trauma repeatedly. However, they had survived something designed to break them, and in doing so, they had proven that human resilience could triumph over even the most sophisticated psychological manipulation. 6 months later, Isabella testified at Holloway's trial, looking directly at the man who had tried to reduce her to a data point in his twisted research. She had learned that the strongest defense against psychological manipulation wasn't avoiding it entirely, but developing the inner strength to resist it when avoidance wasn't possible. Her father had unknowingly prepared her to survive someone much worse than himself. The case became a landmark in understanding psychological abuse and the ethics of human experimentation. The women's story sparked important conversations about consent, trauma, and the responsibility of mental health professionals to protect rather than exploit vulnerable populations. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe for more psychological thrillers that explore the dark side of human behavior. Share this story with others who might benefit from understanding manipulation tactics, and comment below with your thoughts on how we can better protect ourselves from psychological predators. Your engagement helps us continue creating content that sheds light on these important topics.